Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I'm Gemma Files, and this, of course, is No Darkness But Ours. Yep,
Okay, so we were gonna talk a bit about hauntology,
that's right.
stuff generally.
In a lot of ways, when we're talking about hauntology from the point of view of film and storytelling, storytelling, I guess, when we're
Yeah,
talking about it from the point of view of films and books and short stories and stuff like that, and TV shows. What we're talking about is not so much the original idea of what is it? The ghosts of futures past, the ghosts
yes,
of past imaginings of what the future would be like.
yes,
Yeah, and more like the idea of a beautiful reconstruction of a particular moment in time, of a particular moment in of a particular moment in culture.
yeah.
Um,
I think you can see this in. I mean, it's very visible in. I mean, Will McLean's The Apparition phase.
yes,
A very good
that's
evocation of that time, and as someone who's of that same generation and of much that same background. I grew up reading those books like The Osborne Guide to the Supernatural World and The Osborne Book of Ghosts, and I was taking it for granted that ghosts, the paranormal, all these things were a part of the world in which
yes,
they were not necessarily, not necessarily in terms of meaning all the whole, Christian or Catholic, whatever cosmology is true, but in the sense that we now that we're on this thing where science blurs into other things, and where we're considering these things not as necessarily religious phenomena, but as phenomena which are as real, as concrete in their way.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and
The
it's just
whole the
comprehending.
whole idea of like being able to scientifically investigate parapsychology,
Yeah,
matters parapsychological, and I think probably every every country that went through that time period has their own version of this. It could be watching unsolved mysteries. It could be, you know, uh, having people talk about Bigfoot
yeah,
and watching, documentaries about Bigfoot hunters. It could
yes,
be, up here. There's an interesting thing, which is the Philip experiment, which I remember hearing about. Um, I'd say probably about 10 years after it actually happened. But there was a group that decided to create a ghost. Um,
okay.
yeah,
I'm going to say
and
that
a group in Toronto that decided to create a ghost, and they essentially were going to build a haunting tulpa that they called Philip. And interestingly, of course, this kind of feeds into the apparition phase, doesn't it? Yeah.
yes,
But yeah, I mean, it's a weirdly specifically Canadian thing, and yet,
yes,
it
part and parcel of these other.
yeah, there's a real overlap between the British cultural flourishing of this thing and the Canadian cultural flourishing of this thing,
Yeah,
because during that time period, Canada was taking their cultural cues specifically from Europe,
yeah. I
most
think that, I mean,
specifically from Britain.
all of these things, kind of
Yeah,
all of the, even the ones which are nominally, things like which aren't nominally related to what we'd call numinous concepts, things like, which
yeah.
are cryptozoological stuff like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster or Ogopogo or Champ, the Lake Monster, stuff like that.
Oh,
All of this,
or stuff like Bridie Murphy, right? The Bridie
yeah,
Murphy event, or the oh my God, the Satanic Panic,
yeah,
um, and the idea of retrieved memories.
yes. Yeah.
You know,
All of these things kind of coalesce to create a kind of an idea of numinousness, an idea,
yes,
and maybe it was a reaction against, sort of pure kind of rationalism or pure kind of, or the way that, you know, that secularizing everything had kind of thrown out a lot of, possibly
That's right.
sense of throwing out babies with bathwater, where it's like, you know, we've thrown out, so what is there now? Where is morality? Where is purpose? Where is all these things?
So this kind of pseudoscientific numinalism.
Yeah. It was kind of trying to construct a new cosmology, almost, where, you know, you had this sense of there's still weird shit we don't wholly understand but can hope to, but there is still this thing where we think where there's still a possibility that we do in some way go on when our bodies die, that there is, you know, more.
I remember there was a book when I was actually a pretty young kid, like around 7, that I ran across, called "We Never Die," at a garage sale. And it was that idea of being reborn again and again, and you know, and
it certainly made it seem as though reincarnation wasn't this, you know, or past lives sort of hypnotic regression was like an established fact. Whereas, you know, there's I think there's been other things offered, and maybe that's an element of that moment, and that's part of that moment that I think so much of this tried to capture, because what we seem to have now is where that's largely rejected, and we're left with an increasingly fucked and hopeless kind of world with no exit, whereas before the future might be insane. And you know, that cosmology, if you want to call it that, was terrifying as well, because it was full of things like a satanic panic, of stranger danger, of and, you know, and all the other fears, like the
holes through time, folds, stone tape theory,
sand. You know, there's that old joke. You know, I really thought that the Bermuda Triangle and quicksand were going to play a much bigger role than they have had, kind of thing.
The Philadelphia experiment.
Yeah, there's possibility.
Yes.
There are possibilities in that. There's unknown stuff, and the unknown is both, in this context, is both frightening, but also full of hope. It's right, with
kind of awesome. And I think we do see some intrusions from that impulse even today.
Yeah.
You know, creepypasta, mimetic storytelling, developing, you know, sort of web tulpas, I guess, arising from, you know, or matrix theory also, you know, like fold in the matrix theory.
I want to believe that we all want to. I think part of almost all of us, maybe even with the possible exception of people like Richard Dawkins, or perhaps deep down even in him, you know, there's a part of us that wants to believe there is more than this. I think somebody once said, didn't they, that the foundational concept of every religion is there is more to life than this.
That's right.
There is more than what you see.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, even the fact that we are constantly barraged inside of our meat suits and our, you know, and our bone jackets, we're constantly barraged with, you know, chemical messages and electrical messages from parts of ourselves that we cannot see.
Yeah.
You know, and hormonal messages from parts of ourselves that we cannot see. You know, it's like, where do dreams come from? You know, where does love come from? You know, show me love on a map. You know, it's like
Ghost Watch, isn't it? That's one of the.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I mean, in
love
terms
in the
of
lab. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, one very very hauntological creator is Matthew Holness.
Yes.
And you can see that in you know, Dark Place, and in Man to Man with Dean Lerner has got a lot of elements of that. If you haven't seen that, it's I'm not sure if he's as fond of it, but I've always been very fond of that show. He has Dean Lerner, who's played by Richard A. Hardy, who I think appears in Dark Place as a sort of very dodgy chat show host, and Holness is a different guest each week.
Yes.
One is a folk musician called Merriman Weir, and the video for his lost classic folk song from the 70s, Gallows Man, has to be seen to. It really has. You may find yourself humming it the day after as well. But As well as, of course, I mean, there's Possum, which is spectacular, but before
Exactly.
that, there's also a couple of shorter films like A Gun for George and The Snipist, which are very, very about. I mean, the A Gun for George is essentially, the story of this pulp fiction writer who has written a series of incredibly pulpy novels called The Reprisalizer, about this guy wreaking vengeance in like Thanet, in this like suburb, slightly grotty suburb in Kent, with like a couple of revolvers, and driving around in an Austin Allegro, which is one of the most violent. This is about as violently 1970s British a car, not to mention shit, a car as you could wish for. But he's turned this into like about 90 of these pulp books, avenging as somebody puts out the same crime every time in each occasion. And it's kind of like, there was a part of me that actually fantasized about writing novels like this when I was like 13 or 14 years old. And I might have, if I'd had the application to actually churn that shit out, it might have actually got published by someone like, Star Books or one of those outlets that were just very, very fond of kind of gaudy pulp fiction. But A Gun for George is like, and the setting of it, the parts of Thanet or whatever that it's shot in have a very 1970s look to them. There's a lot of brutalist architecture. I think this is very true of Possum as well. Although it's filmed in the present day, it's not a period piece. It's not deliberately set in the 1970s, but there is very little you can see there that would not fit into the 1970s as a setting. I think
there's a particular type of architecture that you can find in and around bits of Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, obviously, but also just parts of Ottawa as well, which I call Cronenbergian architecture, because you look at it and you're like, oh, it's a Cronenberg building, okay.
Yeah, this goes with that whole sort of thing.
Particularly the stuff that was shot in the early to mid 80s and the late 1970s. I mean, I remember going to the Science Center here in Toronto and watching a screening of one of his earliest films, Stereo. And it was like being inside a Cronenberg building, watching Cronenberg, which was entirely shot inside a building exactly like the Science Center.
I mean, the other short film that Hollis made, The Snipist, is something that I think patches into a particularly British paranoia of the late 70s and the early 80s, which was of rabies. Britain was one of the very few countries which had European countries which hadn't had a recorded case of that disease in a very long time. And there was a great. I remember going to the local swimming baths when I was a kid, and there was this big poster of this terrified looking little girl with this huge foaming at the mouth dog leaping at her, like, ah! And it's don't smuggle death. Smuggling pets could bring rabies into Britain. Rabies is a killer. And then you'd see a few posters like that. There was another one which had this huge skull grinning at you, and smuggling pets could bring rabies into, and this tagline, rabies is a killer. And
the fake British sort of folk horror, Scarfolk, right?
Yes.
And Scarfolk is obsessed with rabies, right?
Yeah, it was a very real obsession. This fear that if it got into the country and it spread, pets would be. You'd have to get pets would be kept indoors. Any dog outside without a leash would be shot on sight. And of course, I think the actual, I don't think even the worst kind of projected imaginings with anything, were quite along the lines of something like 28 Days Later. But I think that's where some of our fevered imaginations as kids would have gone. And The Snipist is set in a world in a Britain where something like that has happened. And you basically got a sniper in place, and his brief is to watch for anything of any creature or anyone that's been infected and to kill it.
Right.
It's a very weird and strange and effective little film. I think it's about half an hour. John Hurt provides some voice talent. He's this sort of like disembodied voice coming out of a speaker for the main character, the actual snipist of the title. But again, it's so. I mean,
you know, things are bad when John Hurt is your internal voice.
Yeah.
John Hurt is narrating your life.
Yeah, he's like the sort of the controller or whatever who's giving him the orders kind of thing. But yeah, it still applies. But yeah, it's got a very 70s sort of feel. But actually, again, it's a very British paranoia of that time, very specific, I think, to Britain. But I think every country will have its own little curlicues, its own little idiosyncrasies of that. That period. This just happens to be the one we have in the UK.
Absolutely. So like super early tech and super early computer graphics and those big blown up porous looking black and white photos of things. Yeah. You know, where you go in so close it's like a fucking pointillist painting and you're like, what is that? And then you come a little further out. You're like, oh no, you know, there's something that's, you know, and I don't know whether it translates to younger people. I think it does, though, because, you know, I know for myself, because I lived through that time period and you did too, that there is something that is weirdly, you know, it's like, it's scary in a way that nothing else is, but it's also sort of homely in a way that nothing else is. That it's sort of comforting in a way that nothing else is, because it reminds you of being a child.
Yeah. I mean, in immediate terms, you know, my immediate sort of physical environment was pretty cozy. It was pretty safe. I mean, I had a very hellish time at school with bullying and stuff, but in terms of I had, you know, a pretty you know, a stable home environment with two loving parents, and you know, sort of, you know, pretty not luxurious, but certainly, you know, there was, you know, you weren't going to bed hungry, you weren't cold in the winter, you know, that was all. But it was also quite a suburban existence where things seemed pretty boring, I suppose, in a lot of ways. Certainly to what, you know, you kind of read about. So I mean, there's that Ballard story running wild where you have these kids who've been raised in this little sort of you know, modern kind of modern urban village where everything is kind of
sort of a gated society.
Yes, that's it. A gated community, and everything is not only. I mean, the parents, the parents got all kind of like helicopter parents. So, you know, you'll get something coming up on your computer saying, you know, you did 37 lengths at the pool today. Well done, Jeremy. Which is kind of meant as positive reinforcement, but it's also kind of creepy and very intrusive. But it's also because the parents have done everything they could to eradicate any kind of negative experience from their children's lives. They've effectively created a form of sensory deprivation for them. Because there's a kind of flatness to their lives, because and therefore
the threats or the fascinations, even there's a kind of threat and a fascination in thinking about the big issues. You know, it's like everything's great, everything's fine, everything's wonderful, everything's la la la, you know, but one day I'm gonna die.
Yes.
Except for you know, like anything small that goes wrong reminds you of the biggest stuff that can go wrong.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, I mean, it's not even as huge as like finding a dead cat in the road or something like that and going, whoa, what? Oh my God. It's more like just the concept.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, next year will be great, and the year after that will be great, and the year after that will be great, and then, oh my God, one day I'm gonna die. One day I won't be here. Things
will keep getting better until suddenly they don't.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the illusion, again, that illusion of control, and realizing that and I think maybe as well there's a part of us that kind of we're looking for trouble, or we're looking for we're looking for, you know, what's the danger, what's the threat, and of course, if you create a fairly comfortable environment where you don't have to worry about those immediate issues, you know, your brain kind of goes looking for the wider, more existential shit, like you know,
and mystery also. You know, it's like yeah, the whole uncanny valley thing. That during the day you love your toys, and at night you fear them.
Yeah,
they're sort of like people, but they're sort of not.
Well, I've always liked that idea. The existence of the uncanny valley, you know, implies that at some point in our history there were creatures there was something that looked human but not quite, that wasn't quite, and we were scared of it. It could have been other hominin. Could be a reaction to other hominin species. This doesn't quite fit the template. So
yeah, exactly. You know, like the ugly little boy, which again was something that I saw at the Science Center, was an adaptation of Bradbury's The Ugly Little Boy. You know, who is a Neanderthal kid that has been picked up and sort of brought through time into this pocket. And they're supposed to simply, much like, you know, catch and release with any other species, they're supposed to just take his blood and measure his skull and, you know, and send him back. But the woman who is doing all this becomes more and more convinced that if they send him back, it's entirely possible that he's just going to die because he's like 7, and his parents had probably wandered away. They probably think he was, you know, he was like eaten by something. You know? And she ends up, you know, like hugging him as the time machine, you know, goes off and gets sent back to the Ice Age. And you know, and I remember crying a lot at that. But it's true that if you actually saw a Neanderthal, you'd be horrified, because you would and the Neanderthal would also be horrified.
Yeah.
You'd be like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
There is evidence that the Neanderthals interbred with Cro-Magnons.
I think it took a little while. I think it took a little, you know, it's like, oh, those people. You know?
But it kind of obviously went to some time for, they are demons too. Hello. Although quite possibly there was like a Neanderthal.
Lumpy man. I hear you are really good at making things.
Well, there could have been like a Cro-Magnon version of Gemma Files there, who was everyone else is like, it's a monster, run away, and this one's like, I'm going to fuck it.
Or I'm at least going to think about how you could fuck it.
I saw that cartoon again.
I don't know. You know, it's like, in the brain, fine. In the world, maybe not.
Obviously, in the world, at least some of the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals clearly decided to do the old bow chicka bow wow.
Absolutely did.
I just remember that I saw that cartoon that I often associate with you. I think maybe I first saw it from you. It was like a mermaid playing a song on a rock, and some pirate captain leans over and says, "Can you? I don't like that thing you do. Can you do something else instead?" And just goes, "I will fucking increase the fucking thing."
Yep. Yes, that's Kate Beaton. I will increase the fucking thing. It's like, oh, you don't like it, huh? Fuck you. Or rather don't.
Fuck the Neanderthal instead. I would make the obvious jokes about Trump supporters, but that's probably a bit of an insult to Neanderthals.
It's true.
I did see somebody, sort of comment something about dogs or whatever, and I forget what the context was, but they suggested Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, might be one of them, and I said that's very, very insulting to dogs. I'm pretty sure that Braverman's only involvement with canines is to trying to turn their puppies into a coat, you know. I mean, Cruella, you know. So why not? I did you saw this? There's that thing of the trigger warning that's being included with screenings of 101 Dalmatians, you know, contains smoking. I mean,
that's true. Yes, you know, making dogs into a Coke, that's one thing, but you know,
you know, someone's smoking. That's we're going to concentrate.
Heteronormativity, weird fashion, skinning puppies, and smoking.
Yes. But back to hauntology.
Back to hauntology.
It turns up an awful lot of those things. I mean,
I do think that also, you know, looking for threat, looking for, you know, the realization that under what appears to be the green field coming off like a lid, right? Under, you know, under normalcy is bugs.
Yes, that's more,
you know,
like blue velvet.
Or did you ever see? Do you remember Sprockets on SNL? On Saturday Night Live, there was this thing, Dieter from Sprockets. And it was like this weird sort of German talk show. And one time with this extremely, you know, sort of new wave looking dude who would have, you know, various friends of his on, and they would all be strange artists, you know, and one of them was Kyle MacLachlan. So Kyle MacLachlan comes on and is like, yes, this is my friend, you know, Helmut or whatever. You know, it's like, Helmut, what do you have for us today? Well, I have, of course, Dieter. Here is a photograph that I took of a dead hobo in the park, a dead vamp in the park, as one finds often. But when one turns him over, you see ants.
Oh God, I never saw that. That sounds brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and it's a lot like that. It's like under the green fields lid is ants, is, you know, dead things. It's, you know, the scissor man, you know, it's there's just always this sense that things are not as good as you think they are. Things are not as comfortable as you think they are. And hauntological horror just really, you know, sticks its thumb into the eye of that idea and just starts going like this.
And there's the duality of, there is the, as you say, there's the comforting element of it.
Mm-hmm.
For people of our generation, it's an evocation of childhood and of time of what was for many of us personally, at least, not all of us, but for at least for many of us, was at least a fairly comfortable and safe time in many respects. There was a sense of a world outside being much more complex than we realized, but in ways that were cool and and exciting as well as scary, whereas now they're just depressing and scary.
Yeah.
But there's the idea of the complexity of it all was and the weird and the other weirds and the weird stuff we didn't understand was actually exciting, because, you know, there are creatures out there like Bigfoot. There could be a fucking plesiosaur in Loch Ness. There could be, all these kind of fantastic things waiting to be discovered and seen, and that's kind of So it's both frightening and enthralling, and there's that double edginess. So we will be back next time and to lower the tone of the conversation again and more interesting stuff to talk shit about. But until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
I've been Gemma Files, and this, of course, has been No Darkness.
Darkness.
But ours.